I found 17 digitigrade prints in the sand around my tent that morning. Each one was deeper at the toe pads than any wolf track should be. I'd driven up to Seney Wilderness in Michigan's Upper Peninsula for a long weekend, looking to get away from the noise down in Grand Rapids. October in the UP, the tourists were gone. The hunters hadn't arrived yet, and the mosquitoes had finally died off. Perfect timing for some peace and quiet in the backcountry. The drive from Grand Rapids took about 6 hours, most of it on 2-lane highways, cutting through endless stretches of maple, birch, and pine. I'd been planning this trip since spring, ever since my buddy Marcus told me about the camping opportunities in the Seney area. Remote sites, good fishing, and minimal crowds once the fall colors peaked. I'd picked a backcountry site near a beaver pond, maybe 3 miles from the parking area off Forest Road 436. The walk-in was perfect. Just the crunch of dead leaves under my boots, the occasional splash from the pond, and that clean smell of decomposing maple leaves mixed with pine sap. Set up my 2-person dome tent on a sandy ridge about 40 yards from the water. Close enough to hear the beavers working, but far enough back to stay dry if they decided to expand their dam overnight. The weather was crisp, but not cold, maybe 45 degrees with a clear sky. I got my camp stove going, heated up some beef stew, and settled in with a beer to watch the pond. Around 8:30, a great blue heron landed near the far shore and started fishing in the shallows. A pair of mallards worked the opposite end, dabbling for aquatic plants. Normal wilderness evening, exactly what I'd come for. I'd brought a book, some thriller I'd been meaning to finish, and was reading by headlamp around 11 when I heard the footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, coming from the direction of the parking trail, but not on it. Something was walking through the underbrush, maybe 50 yards out, moving in my general direction. I clicked off the headlamp and listened carefully. The stride was wrong, too long for a person, too regular for a bear wandering through timber. Each step landed with purpose, like something that knew exactly where it was going and wasn't concerned about making noise. I'd heard deer, elk, even moose moving through the forest at night, and this wasn't any of those. This was definitely bipedal, but with a gait I couldn't identify. The footsteps curved around my camp in a wide arc, staying just beyond the light cast by my camp stove's blue flame. I could hear breathing now, deep, controlled respirations, not labored like a running animal, but the kind of measured breathing that comes with focus and intelligence. Then it stopped, right at the edge of the firelight, maybe 15 feet from my tent. I held, perfectly still, controlling my own breathing, listening to my heartbeat in my ears. The other breathing continued for maybe 2 minutes, steady and patient. Then I heard sniffing. Long, deliberate draws of air, like a large dog investigating something new and interesting. It was testing my scent, learning about me, cataloging my presence. The sniffing moved around my tent in a clockwise direction. I could track its position by sound alone. North side of my tent, then east, then south. Whatever this was, it was systematically examining my campsite, taking its time, showing no fear of discovery. Finally, the footsteps resumed, completing their circle around my camp, before heading back toward the cedar swamp on the far side of the pond. I waited another 20 minutes before turning my headlamp back on, and even then I kept it pointed away from the direction the sounds had gone. Didn't sleep much that night. Every time I started to doze off, I'd hear something. A twig snap, the rustle of leaves, the soft plash of something drinking from the pond. Probably normal wilderness sounds, beaver activity, maybe a deer coming down to water. But they kept me on edge, hyper-aware of every noise outside the thin nylon walls of my tent. Dawn came grey and cold, with a layer of mist hanging over the beaver pond. I crawled out of my tent and immediately saw the tracks. They were everywhere in the soft sand around my campsite. Digitigrade prints, like a dog or wolf, but enormous. Nearly 6 inches long from heel pad to claw tips, with deep claw marks extending another inch beyond the toe pads. The individual pads were clearly defined, showing the classic four-toe pattern I'd expect from a canine, but the size was impossible for any wolf I'd ever seen. The stride length was what really caught my attention. When whatever made these tracks was walking upright, the distance between prints was nearly 4 feet. That suggested something with very long legs, much longer than a wolf's hind legs would be, even if it could somehow walk bipedal for extended distances. I followed the trail around my tent 3 complete times. Perfect circles, each one about 20 feet out from my guy lines. Whatever made these tracks had been studying my camp methodically, learning the layout, probably deciding whether I represented a threat or just a curiosity. My trail camera was mounted on a pine tree about 30 yards away, aimed at the tent to catch any wildlife that might wander through during the night. I'd set it up more out of curiosity than security, hoping to get some photos of the local deer population. I checked the SD card over breakfast, scrolling through hours of empty frames until 2:47 a.m. Then I saw it. 2 red dots hanging in the darkness, maybe 7 feet off the ground. Eyeshine, definitely, caught by the camera's infrared flash. But these eyes were too wide set for any wolf I'd ever seen, spaced maybe 8 inches apart. The eyes held steady for maybe 8 seconds, looking directly at the camera lens, then vanished completely. No movement, no blur. Just there one frame and gone the next. I was packing up my gear around 9 a.m. when I heard the howl. It came from across the pond, deep in the cedar swamp, where the footsteps had disappeared hours earlier. Started low and mournful, almost like a wolf howl, then rose to something higher and more complex. Two-tone, like 2 voices harmonizing. It lasted maybe 6 seconds, then cut off abruptly. The beaver pond went completely silent. No bird calls, no squirrels chattering in the maples, no splash of beaver tails. Even the water seemed to still. The gentle lapping against the shore just stopped. I finished packing in record time and headed for the trail back to my truck. The digitigrade prints led toward the swamp, but I wasn't interested in following them. I'd gotten what I came for, peace and quiet in the wilderness, but this felt like something else entirely. Driving out on Forest Road 436, I kept checking my rearview mirror. The feeling of being watched followed me for the first several miles, like something was keeping pace just inside the tree line, matching my speed. It wasn't until I hit Highway 28 and started seeing other traffic that the tension finally left my shoulders. I never did figure out what left those prints in the sand around my tent, but I know this much. Whatever was out there that night, it was intelligent, curious, and patient, and it knew I was there long before I knew about it. Camera 7 showed something running on 4 legs across the yard, then standing up like a person in the span of 3 frames. I'd been working night security at the old Northland paper mill for about 8 months when this happened. The plant shut down in early 2019, but Consolidated Paper kept me on to watch the equipment while they figured out what to do with the place. 12-hour shifts, 6 nights a week. Mostly just me and 16 security cameras scattered around the 40-acre property. The job wasn't bad, really. Decent pay for basically watching monitors and doing hourly patrols. The mill sits on the Flambeau River about 15 miles south of Park Falls, backed up to thousands of acres of Chequamegon National Forest. During the day, you'd see deer, sometimes a black bear wandering through the equipment yard looking for scraps. At night, mostly just shadows and the occasional coyote or red fox. Normal Wisconsin Northwoods activity. I'd gotten used to the routine. Check the monitors every 15 minutes, walk the perimeter twice per shift, log anything unusual in the security report. Most nights, the only excitement was a raccoon setting off a motion sensor or an owl landing on one of the camera housings. It was a Tuesday in late September, around 12:40 a.m., when the motion sensor on camera 7 triggered my monitor. Camera 7 covered the back lot where they used to store wood chips, now just an empty expanse of cracked asphalt bordered by forest. I looked up from my crossword puzzle to see something large moving fast across the lot. At first glance, it looked like a big dog or maybe a wolf running full sprint from the tree line toward the equipment storage area. Dark fur moving with the fluid gait of a quadruped at speed, head low and focused. Nothing particularly unusual for that area. We'd had coyotes and the occasional wolf pass through before. I was about to look back at my puzzle when the thing did something impossible. Mid-stride, without slowing down or breaking rhythm, it transitioned from 4 legs to 2, just like that. One frame showing a large quadruped at full gallop, the next showing something upright, bipedal, still moving at exactly the same speed across the asphalt. I immediately rewound the footage, watching it again in slow motion. The transition was fluid, natural, like switching gaits was the most normal thing in the world. The spine seemed to straighten, the rear legs lengthened, and what had been 4 legs became arms that swung naturally as it continued running. Whatever this was, it was clearly built to move both ways. Now bipedal, the creature slowed to a purposeful walk as it approached the chain-link fence that separated the mill property from the national forest. It moved with obvious intelligence, like it knew exactly where it was going and had done this route before. At the fence, it stopped and turned back toward camera 7. Even through the grainy black and white infrared footage, I could see the eyeshine clearly. 2 red dots, bright and steady, looking directly into the camera lens with what I can only describe as awareness. The eyes were set wide apart, maybe 8 or 9 inches, and positioned about 7 feet off the ground, based on the fence height for reference. The creature studied the camera for maybe 10 seconds, tilting its head slightly, like a dog trying to understand something new. Then it turned back to the fence, crouched slightly, and cleared the 8-foot chain link in a single effortless bound. It landed on the far side without breaking stride and disappeared into the dense pine and maple forest. My radio had been crackling with static during the entire encounter, which wasn't particularly unusual. The old mill equipment and power lines threw off a lot of electromagnetic interference. But as soon as the creature vanished into the trees, the static cleared up completely, leaving just clean silence on all channels. I called my supervisor, Jim Henley, who lived about 20 minutes away in Park Falls. Jim had been with Consolidated Paper for 30 years and had seen just about everything. He told me to do a full perimeter check and call him back if I found anything that looked like vandalism or attempted break-in. I grabbed my patrol flashlight, portable radio, and the aluminum baseball bat we kept in the security office, then headed outside into the cool September night. The back lot was quiet, except for the steady hum of the security lights and the distant sound of the Flambeau River running over the small dam upstream. I walked the exact route the creature had taken, looking for prints, fur, disturbed gravel, anything that might tell me what I'd actually seen. The asphalt showed some scuff marks, but nothing clear enough to call tracks. The fence showed no damage, no bent links, no hair caught on the wire mesh. Nothing to indicate something large and powerful had just vaulted over it. I checked camera 8, which covered the tree line on the forest side of the fence. At 12:42 a.m., just 60 seconds after the fence jump, I could make out a dark shape moving through the timber, maybe 50 yards back from the property line. The infrared illuminators didn't reach that far, so it was just a shadow weaving between the pine trunks, but the movement was consistent with something large and bipedal. By 1:15 a.m., I was back in the security office, reviewing the footage again and again. Frame by frame, the transition from quadruped to biped looked even stranger. The anatomy seemed to physically shift, spine straightening, limb proportions changing, center of gravity adjusting. It should have been awkward, unstable, like watching someone try to run on their hind legs. Instead, it looked practiced, effortless, like this was just another way of moving. I spent the rest of my shift watching the monitors with extra attention, but nothing else showed up on any of the 16 cameras. The remainder of the night was perfectly routine. A few deer moving through the south lot around 3 a.m., an owl landing on camera 12 around 4:30. Nothing unusual. The day shift supervisor, Dave Kowalski, arrived at 7 a.m. asking if anything had happened overnight. Dave was a good guy, been with the company almost as long as Jim, and had a no-nonsense attitude about most things. I showed him the footage from camera 7. Dave watched it twice, rubbing his grey beard, then leaned back in his chair and looked at me with raised eyebrows. "Well, that's interesting," he said. "That's definitely new." Apparently, I wasn't the first security guard to report something unusual around the mill property. Dave mentioned a couple of other incidents over the past few years. Strange howls echoing from the forest during night shifts. Pieces of equipment that somehow got moved between evening and morning patrols. Motion sensors that triggered repeatedly without anything visible on the corresponding cameras. Management knew about the reports but didn't make a big deal out of them, as long as nothing actually got damaged or stolen. The prevailing theory was wildlife, bears, wolves, maybe the occasional transient looking for shelter. "Probably just a big coyote with mange," Dave said. But he was still staring at the monitor when I clocked out and headed to my truck. I drove home through the quiet streets of Park Falls thinking about those red eyes looking directly into camera 7. The intelligence behind that gaze, the way the creature had deliberately turned to acknowledge the camera's presence. It knew it was being watched and simply didn't care. Or maybe it wanted to be seen. That footage is still on the server somewhere in Consolidated Papers' security archives. 16 seconds of something that shouldn't exist moving through a Wisconsin industrial yard, like it owned the place. I made a copy on a thumb drive before I left that job 6 months later, but I've never shown it to anyone else. Some things are better left as personal experiences. Quick pause. If these stories are doing a good job at keeping you company tonight, subscribe to not only know about my newest uploads, but to support this channel as well. Thank you, and let's get back to the stories. My German Shepherd started refusing to go outside after dark, whimpering at the door and backing away from the windows. I'd inherited my grandfather's old farmhouse in northern Wisconsin, about 20 miles east of Haywood, when he passed in late spring. The place had been in our family since the 1940s. 80 acres of mixed timber and pasture, with a solid 2-story house that just needed some updating and maintenance. Rex had been my constant companion for 6 years, a 90-pound German Shepherd with the kind of confidence that comes from excellent breeding and consistent training. He'd never shown fear of anything, not storms, not wildlife, not strange people or situations. He was the type of dog who would investigate first and worry later. We moved to the farmhouse in early September, and for the first few weeks everything seemed perfect. Rex loved having room to run, spent his days exploring the property and his evenings relaxing on the front porch. Normal behavior for a dog who'd spent most of his life in suburban Minneapolis. The change started in early October, right after the first hard frost. Rex began refusing his evening walks. I'd grab his leash and he'd back away from the door, whimpering and showing signs of genuine anxiety. This was completely out of character. Rex had always been eager for his twice daily walks, regardless of weather or time of day. At first, I figured he was just adjusting to rural life, maybe picking up scents from deer or other wildlife that made him nervous. But the behavior got worse instead of better. By mid-October, he wouldn't step off the porch after sunset, no matter how much I coaxed or commanded. During the day, Rex was his normal self, confident, playful, eager to explore the property and investigate every interesting scent. But as soon as the sun started setting, his demeanor would change completely. He'd become agitated, pacing the house and whining softly, checking and rechecking the locks on the doors and windows. The anxiety was focused on the west side of the property, where our yard bordered a dense stand of maple and oak timber. Rex would position himself at the living room window facing that direction and growl softly at something I couldn't see. His hackles would rise, and he'd maintain a low, steady rumble that could go on for hours. Around the same time Rex's behavior changed, the security light on the west side of the house started malfunctioning. It would trigger 2 or 3 times per night, flooding the yard with bright halogen light, then shut off after the normal 2-minute cycle. I'd look outside and see nothing. No deer, no raccoons, no obvious explanation for the motion sensor activation. I checked the light fixture, cleaned the sensor lens, even replaced the bulbs. But the random triggering continued. The light would come on, illuminate an empty yard, and shut off. Rex would become even more agitated during these episodes, pressing himself against my legs and trembling. One morning in late October, I found the prints. They were all through my vegetable garden, which I'd been meaning to clean up before winter. Large, canine-shaped impressions in the soft soil between the tomato rows, but far bigger than any dog tracks I'd ever seen. The prints were nearly 6 inches long, with deep claw marks extending well beyond the toe pads. What struck me most was the pattern. The tracks showed a systematic examination of the garden, not random wandering like you'd expect from a wild animal, but purposeful investigation of specific plants and structures. Whatever made these prints had been curious about my garden setup. Taking time to examine the tomato cages, the bean poles, the small shed where I kept tools, Rex refused to approach the garden area. He'd sit on the porch and stare at it, whining softly, but wouldn't follow me when I went to investigate the tracks more closely. Every night around 10 p.m., Rex would take up position at the living room window and begin his low growling routine, focused on a specific spot at the edge of the tree line, maybe 60 yards from the house. I'd grab binoculars and scan the area, but never saw anything beyond the normal shadows and movement of branches in the wind. The morning after each of these episodes, I'd find evidence that something large had been in that exact spot. Broken branches 6 to 8 feet off the ground, disturbed leaf litter in a rough circle. Sometimes what looked like impressions in the forest floor, where something heavy had been standing for an extended period. My nearest neighbor, Dale Kowalski, stopped by in early November to check on how I was settling in. Dale farmed about a quarter section adjacent to my property and had known my grandfather for decades. Over coffee, I mentioned that Rex had been acting strangely, showing anxiety about something in the woods. Dale nodded knowingly. "We've lost a few chickens this fall," he said. "Something's been hitting the henhouse maybe once a week. Doesn't take many birds, just 2 or 3, but it gets in and out without triggering our motion lights. My wife thinks it might be a fisher or a fox, but I've never seen tracks." Dale paused, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. "Your grandfather mentioned seeing things over the years. Never made a big deal about it, but he'd hint that there were unusual neighbors in these woods. Said as long as you showed respect and didn't cause problems, they'd leave you alone." That conversation helped me understand Rex's behavior differently. My dog wasn't showing fear, he was showing respect. Every night, he'd position himself at the window and acknowledge whatever lived in the tree line, maintaining visual contact until it moved on. A ritual that kept the peace between our household and the forest. I started joining Rex at the window during his evening vigils. I couldn't see what he was watching, but I'd sit beside him and wait patiently until his growling stopped and he relaxed. It seemed to help both of us. The arrangement has worked for 3 years now. Rex and I have our evening routine. We acknowledge our neighbor in the woods, maintain respectful distance, and everyone coexists peacefully. The security light still triggers occasionally. I still find large tracks in the garden after storms, but nothing threatens or aggressive ever happens. During the day, the property feels completely normal. Rex plays in the yard. I work on house projects. We both enjoy the rural setting and the space to spread out. It's only in the evening hours that we remember we're sharing this land with something else. I've thought about installing trail cameras or motion sensors to get a better understanding of what's out there, but some questions are better left unanswered. My grandfather lived here peacefully for 70 years, without needing photographic evidence of his forest neighbors. Rex has taught me that coexistence doesn't require complete understanding. Sometimes showing respect and maintaining proper boundaries is enough. I woke to find 3 days' worth of perfectly seasoned firewood stacked beside my tent after the storm ruined my supply. I'd planned a 4-day backpacking trip through the Porcupine Mountains Wilderness State Park in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, following the Lake Superior Trail along the most remote section of the park's backcountry. October hiking in the Porcupines, challenging terrain, spectacular fall colors, and the kind of solitude you can't find in more popular wilderness areas. The weather forecast had called for partly cloudy skies with maybe a chance of light showers later in the week. Typical Upper Peninsula autumn weather, nothing that should have caused problems for an experienced backpacker with proper rain gear. Forecasts in the Upper Peninsula can be wildly optimistic. I was 2 days into the trip, camped at a backcountry site about 6 miles from the nearest trailhead, when the storm hit with no warning. What started as light rain around dinner time became a full-scale thunderstorm with horizontal precipitation and wind gusts that had me seriously worried about treefall. The storm lasted most of the night, dumping maybe 4 inches of rain and turning every low spot in the forest into a temporary lake. My tent held up fine, but everything outside got absolutely soaked, including my carefully prepared supply of split firewood that I'd been depending on for warmth and cooking. By morning, my 3-day supply of seasoned hardwood was completely waterlogged. Not just damp, but saturated to the point where it wouldn't burn even with the best fire starting techniques. I was facing 2 more nights in near freezing temperatures without any reliable heat source. The situation wasn't immediately dangerous. I had adequate clothing and a good sleeping bag, but it would be miserable and potentially risky if the weather stayed cold and wet. More importantly, I couldn't cook properly without a fire, which meant rationing food and dealing with poor nutrition for the remainder of the trip. I spent most of that morning trying to find dry wood in the saturated forest. Everything was soaked through, from the smallest twigs to the largest deadfall. Even wood that looked promising on the outside was waterlogged when I split it open. By afternoon, I was seriously considering hiking out early rather than spending 2 more nights without fire. The trail conditions were muddy and treacherous after the storm, but it was better than being cold and hungry in a wet forest. That decision became unnecessary when I woke up the next morning. Someone had stacked 3 days' worth of perfectly dry, seasoned firewood beside my tent while I slept. Not random pieces of forest deadfall, but quality split hardwood that had been properly seasoned for optimal burning. The stack included everything I needed: fine kindling for fire starting, medium pieces for building up heat, and larger splits that would burn for hours with minimal attention. The wood quality was remarkable. Each piece had been selected for specific burning characteristics and arranged in order of use. The kindling was bone dry and split thin enough to catch fire immediately. The larger pieces were dense hardwood that would produce steady heat and long-lasting coals perfect for cooking. Most impressive was the species selection. The stack contained a mixture of oak, maple, birch, and what looked like cherry. Exactly the combination an experienced woodsman would choose for camp heating and cooking. Each species had different burning properties, and they were arranged to take advantage of those characteristics. Walking around my campsite, I found large prints in the mud left by the previous night's rain. The familiar canine-shaped tracks, but these showed something remarkable: a systematic pattern that suggested careful scouting and selection of the best available deadfall. Following the tracks backward from my campsite, I found the source area about 100 yards away, in a section of forest where storm damage had brought down several large maples. But this wasn't random scavenging. The harvesting showed intelligent selection of the driest, most suitable pieces. Only the deadfall that would burn cleanly had been taken. Punky wood was left untouched. Green wood was ignored completely, and even the dry pieces were selected based on size and burning characteristics. It was the kind of wood selection that takes years of experience to master. The firewood continued appearing throughout the remainder of my trip. Each morning, I'd find my supply replenished with exactly what I needed for that day's cooking and heating requirements. Never too much, never too little, always perfectly matched to my actual needs. The final morning, I found something extra in the wood stack. Several pieces of what looked like paper birch bark, but processed in a way I'd never seen. The bark had been treated somehow to make it an incredibly effective fire starter, better than any commercial tinder I'd ever used. I spent my last day experimenting with different cooking techniques using the superior firewood. The heat was consistent, the coals lasted for hours, and the smoke production was minimal. It was better than anything I could have brought from home or purchased commercially. Before hiking out, I left a significant portion of my remaining food supplies beside the fire ring. Quality trail meals, energy bars, and some coffee that I thought my mysterious helper might appreciate. I also left a note of thanks, though I suspected it would disappear like everything else. Everything was gone when I packed up my tent the next morning. I found it standing at the perimeter fence at 2:30 a.m., 7 feet tall and completely motionless, just watching. I'd been working security for Consolidated Mining for about 3 years when this happened, mostly covering their active operations down near Ishpeming. But once a month, they'd send me up to the old Gribben mine to check on the mothballed equipment and make sure nobody was stealing copper wire or scrap metal. The Gribben operation had been shut down since 2015, when iron ore prices dropped and made the smaller mines unprofitable. But they kept the facility maintained in case commodity prices recovered enough to justify reopening. My job was to do a monthly patrol, check the buildings and equipment, test the security systems, and file a report. The site was about 40 miles north of Marquette, accessible only by a narrow gravel road that wound through maybe 15 miles of state forest. No cell phone coverage, no neighbors, just thousands of acres of maple, birch, and pine stretching to the Canadian border, the kind of place where you could scream for help and nobody would ever hear you. I usually tried to do these patrols during daylight hours, but October had been busy with vandalism problems at the active sites. By the time I got free to drive up to Gribben, it was already past midnight on a cloudy Thursday with no moon. The facility was laid out in a rough rectangle, maybe 20 acres total, surrounded by a 10-foot chain link fence topped with razor wire. Inside the perimeter were the main processing buildings, equipment storage areas, the old head frame from the mine shaft, and various maintenance structures. Everything powered down and locked up, but well maintained and clearly valuable enough to warrant security patrols. I parked my truck near the main gate and started my routine walkthrough. Check the padlocks on the buildings, test the motion sensor lights, look for signs of attempted break-ins or copper theft. The whole patrol usually took about 2 hours, then I'd drive back to Marquette and file my report. Everything looked normal for the first hour. All the buildings were secure. The equipment was where it should be. No fresh tire tracks or footprints around the gate. Just another routine monthly check at a dead mining facility. I was testing the floodlights around the equipment storage area when I noticed the eyeshine. 2 red dots reflecting back at me from the far side of the compound, maybe 100 yards away near the perimeter fence. At first, I figured it was probably a deer that had wandered close to the fence and gotten caught in the light. We'd see them occasionally around the active mines, drawn by the salt from winter road treatments. But when I turned my flashlight directly toward the eyeshine, it didn't bolt like a deer would. It just held steady, patient and unblinking, looking back at me with what I can only describe as curiosity. I walked closer, keeping my light trained on the eyes. As the distance closed, I could make out the shape attached to them. Tall, dark, definitely bipedal. It was standing maybe 10 feet back from the fence, completely motionless, just watching me approach. By the time I got within 50 feet, I could see it clearly. The thing was huge, easily 7 feet tall, with a build that suggested both power and intelligence. It was standing upright like a person, but the proportions were wrong. Too tall, arms too long, head shaped differently than human. Most animals, when confronted by a human with a bright light, will either run away or show some kind of defensive posturing. This thing did neither. It just stood there, studying me with obvious intelligence, like it was trying to figure out what I was and what I was doing at the mine site. The stare down lasted maybe 20 minutes. I kept my flashlight pointed at the creature, and it kept looking back at me with those steady red eyes. No aggression, no fear, just mutual observation. It felt almost like a conversation. though neither of us made a sound. My portable radio had been crackling with static on and off throughout the patrol, which wasn't unusual in that area. Lots of electrical interference from the abandoned mining equipment and power lines. But during the encounter with the creature, the static got much worse, eventually becoming a steady hiss that made the radio unusable. Finally, the thing seemed to lose interest in me. It turned with fluid, natural movement and walked back into the forest, moving upright with the easy gait of something perfectly comfortable on two legs. Within 30 seconds, it had vanished completely into the dense timber. As soon as the creature disappeared, my radio cleared up and returned to normal operation. I spent another hour checking the perimeter fence where the thing had been standing. No damage to the chain link, no hair caught on the wire, no clear footprints in the rocky soil. But the ground showed some disturbance, like something heavy had been standing there for an extended period. The rest of my patrol revealed something interesting. All of the mining equipment was exactly where it should be, nothing missing or damaged. But several pieces had been moved slightly. A portable generator rotated about 30 degrees. A maintenance cart rolled maybe 3 feet from its usual position. Some toolboxes rearranged on their shelving. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would show up in my report as vandalism or theft, but clear evidence that something with considerable intelligence and dexterity had been examining the equipment, probably trying to understand what it was and how it worked. I finished my patrol around 4:30 a.m. and drove back to Marquette as the sun was coming up. In my report, I mentioned seeing a large animal near the perimeter, but didn't go into detail about the size or bipedal posture. Consolidated Mining paid me to check on their equipment, not to file reports about cryptid encounters. My supervisor, Carol Hendricks, read the report and asked if I thought we needed to increase patrols or install additional security measures. I told her the equipment was secure and didn't appear to be at risk. A few weeks later, over beers after work, Carol mentioned that I wasn't the first guard to report unusual animal activity at the Gribben site. Apparently, there had been several similar encounters over the years. Large animals that showed no fear of humans, equipment that got moved around without being damaged, strange sounds echoing from the forest during night patrols. As long as nothing gets stolen or vandalized, corporate doesn't want to hear about it, she said. But between you and me, there's something up there that's a lot smarter than your average bear. I continued doing monthly patrols at Gribben for another year, before transferring to a position closer to home. Never saw the red-eyed creature again, though I often had the feeling of being watched during those late-night visits. The equipment continued showing subtle signs of examination. Nothing dramatic, just small changes that suggested ongoing curiosity from something with opposable thumbs and considerable intelligence. Consolidated Mining eventually sold the Gribben facility to a scrap dealer in 2020. I don't know if the new owners have experienced anything unusual, but I hope they're respectful of whatever's living in those woods. Some neighbors are better left undisturbed. My German Shepherd started refusing to go outside after dark, whimpering at the door and backing away from the windows. I'd inherited my grandfather's old farmhouse in northern Wisconsin, about 20 miles east of Haywood, when he passed in late spring. The place had been in our family since the 1940s. 80 acres of mixed timber and pasture, with a solid 2-story house that just needed some updating and maintenance. Rex had been my constant companion for 6 years, a 90-pound German Shepherd with the kind of confidence that comes from excellent breeding and consistent training. He'd never shown fear of anything. Not storms, not wildlife, not strange people or situations. He was the type of dog who would investigate first and worry later. We moved to the farmhouse in early September, and for the first few weeks everything seemed perfect. Rex loved having room to run, spent his days exploring the property and his evenings relaxing on the front porch. Normal behavior for a dog who'd spent most of his life in suburban Minneapolis. The change started in early October, right after the first hard frost. Rex began refusing his evening walks. I'd grab his leash and he'd back away from the door, whimpering and showing signs of genuine anxiety. This was completely out of character. Rex had always been eager for his twice daily walks, regardless of weather or time of day. At first, I figured he was just adjusting to rural life, maybe picking up scents from deer or other wildlife that made him nervous. But the behavior got worse instead of better. By mid-October, he wouldn't step off the porch after sunset, no matter how much I coaxed or commanded. During the day, Rex was his normal self, confident, playful, eager to explore the property and investigate every interesting scent. But as soon as the sun started setting, his demeanor would change completely. He'd become agitated, pacing the house and whining softly, checking and rechecking the locks on the doors and windows. The anxiety was focused on the west side of the property, where our yard bordered a dense stand of maple and oak timber. Rex would position himself at the living room window facing that direction and growl softly at something I couldn't see. His hackles would rise and he'd maintain a low, steady rumble that could go on for hours. Around the same time Rex's behavior changed, the security light on the west side of the house started malfunctioning. It would trigger 2 or 3 times per night, flooding the yard with bright halogen light, then shut off after the normal 2-minute cycle. I'd look outside and see nothing. No deer, no raccoons, no obvious explanation for the motion sensor activation. I checked the light fixture, cleaned the sensor lens, even replaced the bulbs, but the random triggering continued. The light would come on, illuminate an empty yard, and shut off. Rex would become even more agitated during these episodes, pressing himself against my legs and trembling. One morning in late October, I found the prints. They were all through my vegetable garden, which I'd been meaning to clean up before winter. Large, canine-shaped impressions in the soft soil between the tomato rows, but far bigger than any dog tracks I'd ever seen. The prints were nearly 6 inches long, with deep claw marks extending well beyond the toe pads. What struck me most was the pattern. The tracks showed a systematic examination of the garden, not random wandering like you'd expect from a wild animal, but purposeful investigation of specific plants and structures. Whatever made these prints had been curious about my garden setup, taking time to examine the tomato cages, the bean poles, the small shed where I kept tools. Rex refused to approach the garden area. He'd sit on the porch and stare at it, whining softly, but wouldn't follow me when I went to investigate the tracks more closely. Every night around 10 p.m., Rex would take up position at the living room window and begin his low growling routine, focused on a specific spot at the edge of the tree line, maybe 60 yards from the house. I'd grab binoculars and scan the area, but never saw anything beyond the normal shadows and movement of branches in the wind. The morning after each of these episodes, I'd find evidence that something large had been in that exact spot. Broken branches 6 to 8 feet off the ground, disturbed leaf litter in a rough circle, sometimes what looked like impressions in the forest floor, where something heavy had been standing for an extended period. My nearest neighbor, Del Kowalski, stopped by in early November to check on how I was settling in. Dale farmed about a quarter section adjacent to my property and had known my grandfather for decades. Over coffee, I mentioned that Rex had been acting strangely, showing anxiety about something in the woods. Dale nodded knowingly. "We've lost a few chickens this fall," he said. "Something's been hitting the hen house maybe once a week. Doesn't take many birds, just 2 or 3, but it gets in and out without triggering our motion lights. My wife thinks it might be a fisher or a fox, but I've never seen tracks." Dale paused, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. "Your grandfather mentioned seeing things over the years. Never made a big deal about it, but he'd hint that there were unusual neighbors in these woods. Said as long as you showed respect and didn't cause problems, they'd leave you alone." That conversation helped me understand Rex's behavior differently. My dog wasn't showing fear, he was showing respect. Every night, he'd position himself at the window and acknowledge whatever lived in the tree line, maintaining visual contact until it moved on. A ritual that kept the peace between our household and the forest. I started joining Rex at the window during his evening vigils. I couldn't see what he was watching, but I'd sit beside him and wait patiently until his growling stopped and he relaxed. It seemed to help both of us. The arrangement has worked for 3 years now. Rex and I have our evening routine. We acknowledge our neighbor in the woods, maintain respectful distance, and everyone coexists peacefully. The security light still triggers occasionally. I still find large tracks in the garden after storms, but nothing threatens or aggressive ever happens. During the day, the property feels completely normal. Rex plays in the yard. I work on house projects. We both enjoy the rural setting and the space to spread out. It's only in the evening hours that we remember we're sharing this land with something else. I've thought about installing trail cameras or motion sensors to get a better understanding of what's out there. But some questions are better left unanswered. My grandfather lived here peacefully for 70 years without needing photographic evidence of his forest neighbors. Rex has taught me that coexistence doesn't require complete understanding. Sometimes showing respect and maintaining proper boundaries is enough. I left a chaotic supply delivery on the loading dock and found it sorted by department with impossible precision by dawn. I'd been working night shift as receiving supervisor at Northland Regional Hospital for about 4 years when this started happening. We're a small rural hospital in northern Minnesota, serving maybe 20,000 people across 3 counties. But we're the only medical facility for 60 miles in any direction. My job was straightforward: receive deliveries, sort supplies by department, and stock the various units before the day shift arrived. Medical supplies, pharmaceuticals, equipment parts, linens, food service items. Everything that kept the hospital running came through my loading dock between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. It was a Tuesday night in late November when the pattern started. The weekly medical supply truck from Duluth had arrived around midnight, about 2 hours late due to road conditions. The driver, a guy named Pete, who'd been running that route for years, was clearly frustrated with his delivery schedule. "Sorry I'm late," Pete said, backing up to the dock. "This load got messed up at the warehouse. Nothing's sorted right, and I've got 3 more stops before I get home." He wasn't kidding. When we opened the truck, the cargo area was a disaster. Boxes of surgical supplies mixed with cleaning products, pharmaceutical shipments stacked under heavy equipment parts, sterile packages scattered throughout the load. It would take me most of the night to sort through everything and get it properly distributed. Pete helped me unload about half the truck before his radio crackled with an urgent message from dispatch. Problem at his next stop. He needed to get there immediately to meet a receiving clerk who was staying late specifically for his delivery. "Can you handle the rest?" he asked. "I'll come back in the morning to get the truck." I told him to go ahead. Unloading and sorting was part of my job anyway, and Pete was already running behind schedule. He climbed in his cab and headed out into the snow, leaving me with a truck about 40% empty and supplies scattered across the loading dock. That's when my pager went off. Code blue in the ICU. All available personnel to respond immediately. As receiving supervisor, I wasn't part of the medical response team, but I was trained in CPR and had helped with emergencies before when they needed extra hands. I locked the loading dock, secured what supplies I could, and ran upstairs to the ICU. The emergency lasted about 3 hours. Elderly patient with complications from surgery, touch and go for most of the night. By the time we got him stabilized and I could return to my regular duties, it was nearly 4 a.m. I expected to find the loading dock exactly as I'd left it. Partially unloaded truck, supplies scattered on the dock, hours of sorting work ahead of me. Instead, I found something impossible. The truck was completely empty. All the remaining supplies had been unloaded and arranged on the dock with surgical precision. But this wasn't random unloading. Everything was sorted by department, organized by priority, and arranged for efficient distribution throughout the hospital. Surgical supplies were grouped together and labeled by procedure type. Pharmaceutical shipments were sorted by unit and cross-referenced with our standard inventory lists. Even the cleaning supplies were organized by floor and usage frequency. The organization showed detailed knowledge of our hospital's operations, not just what departments needed what supplies, but how those supplies would be used and in what order. Whoever did this work understood healthcare logistics better than most of my day shift colleagues. I checked the security camera that covered the loading dock. The system had malfunctioned during the exact hours I was upstairs with the medical emergency. No footage, no record of what happened or who had done the work. Walking around the truck, I found large prints in the thin snow around the loading dock, canine-shaped but enormous, maybe 6 inches long with the distinct claw marks. The prints circled the truck several times and led to every spot where supplies had been placed. More interesting were the tool marks on some of the boxes. Clean cuts in the cardboard where someone had used a blade to open packages and check contents. But the cuts were precise, almost surgical, made by someone who understood how to open medical shipments without damaging the contents. I spent the rest of my shift distributing the pre-sorted supplies throughout the hospital. Every department got exactly what they needed, in the right quantities, organized for immediate use. It was the most efficient supply distribution I'd ever seen. When Pete came back for his truck around 7 a.m., I told him about finding everything perfectly unloaded and sorted. "Huh," he said, not seeming particularly surprised. "You know, that's happened at a couple of my other stops." Small rural hospitals, usually when there's been some kind of emergency that pulls the night staff away from receiving. Pete climbed into his cab and rolled down the window. "Never figured out who's doing it, but they do good work. Better than most humans, honestly. I've stopped worrying about leaving trucks unattended at hospitals like this." Over the following months, the pattern repeated maybe once every 6 weeks. Always during emergencies that pulled me away from the loading dock for extended periods. Always the same impossible efficiency in unloading and organization. I started leaving detailed inventory lists and department distribution charts on a clipboard by the dock door, not because I expected anyone to read them, but as a courtesy to whoever was helping. The lists were always gone by morning, and the supply distribution was always perfect. The hospital administrator, Dr. Sarah Chen, mentioned the improvement in receiving efficiency during my annual review. "I don't know what you changed in your process," she said, "but our supply chain operations have never been smoother. Whatever you're doing, keep it up." I never told her about the mysterious helper. Some things are better left unexplained, especially when they're benefiting patient care. Our small rural hospital operates on tight margins with minimal staff. Any assistance, regardless of its source, helps us serve our community better. The help continues sporadically, always during genuine emergencies when I'm pulled away from receiving duties. I've never seen my helper, never found any direct evidence beyond the impossibly organized supplies and those large prints in the snow. But I've started leaving small gestures of appreciation. A thermos of hot coffee on cold nights, a note of thanks attached to particularly challenging deliveries. The coffee is always gone by morning, and the notes disappear along with everything else. It feels like a partnership now, though I only know one side of it. I handle the routine work, and something else steps in during emergencies to ensure our hospital never runs short of critical supplies. In rural healthcare, you learn to be grateful for all the help you can get. The pack I'd lost in the storm was waiting by my tent, but everything inside had been carefully cleaned and organized. I'd planned a 5-day solo backpacking trip through the Chequamegon National Forest in northern Wisconsin, following the North Country Trail through some of the most remote sections of the forest. October backpacking, minimal crowds, good weather usually, and the chance to see full colors without dealing with tourist traffic. The trip started perfectly. I'd parked at the Forest Road 390 trailhead and hiked about 12 miles to a backcountry campsite near Lost Lake, a small kettle pond surrounded by maple and birch forest. The weather forecast had called for partly cloudy skies, with maybe a chance of light rain later in the week. Forecasts in northern Wisconsin can be optimistic. I was setting up camp around 5 p.m. when the storm hit, with no warning. 1 minute, I was enjoying a peaceful evening by the lake. The next, I was getting hammered by horizontal rain and wind gusts that had to be pushing 50 miles per hour. Not the kind of weather you want to be caught in while setting up a tent. I managed to get my shelter anchored before the worst of it hit, but I was rushing and not paying attention to gear management. My main backpack, a 60-liter pack with most of my critical equipment, was sitting outside the tent while I organized my sleeping setup. A particularly vicious gust caught the pack and sent it tumbling toward the lake. I watched it bounce between trees, shedding contents as it rolled down the slope toward the water. By the time I could safely leave my tent, the pack had vanished into the storm-dark forest. The next few hours were miserable. The storm continued until well after midnight, dumping maybe 3 inches of rain and keeping me trapped in my tent. I had my sleeping bag and basic survival gear, but I'd lost my camp stove, most of my food, my first aid kit, and my water purification system. Everything I needed for the remaining 4 days of the trip. Morning dawned clear and cold, with that crisp post-storm air that usually makes everything feel fresh and clean. I spent 3 hours searching for my pack, following the likely path it had taken toward the lake and checking every deadfall and thicket where it might have gotten caught. Nothing. The pack had simply vanished into the forest, probably lying at the bottom of Lost Lake or buried under storm debris somewhere. I'd never find it. I had 2 choices: hike out immediately and abandon the trip, or try to make do with minimal gear and hope for the best. Neither option appealed to me, but I wasn't equipped to spend 4 days in the wilderness without proper supplies. I decided to hike out, resupply in the town of Glidden, and come back to finish the trip properly. It meant losing 2 days, but it was better than risking a wilderness emergency without adequate equipment. The hike out took most of the day, 12 miles on forest trails, carrying just my sleeping bag and the few items that had been in my tent during the storm. I reached my truck around 4 p.m., drove to Glidden, and spent the evening replacing as much of my lost gear as possible. 2 days later, I hiked back to the Lost Lake campsite with a new pack and replacement equipment. I was curious to see if any of my original gear had washed up on the shore or gotten caught in the timber along the lake edge. I found my pack waiting by my old tent site. Not hidden in the bushes, not partially buried under storm debris. Just sitting upright next to the fire ring, exactly where I would have placed it if I had been organizing my campsite. Like someone had carefully positioned it for me to find. The pack itself looked better than it had when I'd lost it. The fabric had been cleaned of all the mud and pine needles it should have accumulated during its tumble through the forest. The zippers worked smoothly, the straps were properly adjusted, and a torn section of the rain cover had been expertly mended with what looked like plant fibers woven in a tight waterproof pattern. Inside, everything was not only present, but organized with a precision I'd never achieved myself. My camp stove was disassembled, cleaned, and packed with each component wrapped in soft moss to prevent rattling. My first aid supplies were sorted by type and secured with strips of inner bark. Even my spare socks had been washed and dried. The food items were the most remarkable part. Everything that had been in waterproof packaging was cleaned and ready to use, but the items that would have been ruined by the storm, bread, fresh fruit, some crackers, had been replaced with what I can only describe as wilderness alternatives. Where I'd had a loaf of bread, I found flat cakes made from what tasted like acorn flour and wild berries. Instead of my apple and orange, there were perfectly ripe hazelnuts and dried berries I didn't recognize, but that were obviously edible and nutritious. My water bottles had been filled with clean, sweet water that tasted better than anything from my purification system. Walking around the campsite, I found large prints in the soft earth near the lakeshore. The same canine-shaped tracks I'd seen in other encounters, but these showed a different pattern. Instead of the usual single-file movement, these prints suggested someone had been working methodically around my campsite, examining and organizing, taking time and care with each task. The prints approached my tent from multiple directions, but never came closer than about 10 feet. Respectful distance, like someone who understood personal space and property boundaries. I spent 3 more days completing my backpacking trip, using the return gear and the wilderness food supplements. Everything worked perfectly. Better than my original equipment, honestly. The mended rain cover proved completely waterproof during another brief shower, and the wilderness foods were more nutritious and satisfying than my processed camping meals. On my last night, I left a thank you note by the fire ring, along with a small gift, a multi-tool that I hoped might be useful to whoever had helped me. The next morning, both the note and the tool were gone. I've been back to that area of the Chequamegon several times since then, always hoping to catch a glimpse of my mysterious helper. I never have, but I've found other small signs of an intelligent presence in those woods. Trails that are mysteriously clear of deadfall, fire rings that have been cleaned and restocked with dry wood, lost items that reappear in obvious places where their owners might find them. It feels like there's someone out there who genuinely cares about the welfare of wilderness visitors, someone who understands that people sometimes need help in the forest and is willing to provide it quietly without recognition or reward. I've started carrying a few extra supplies on my backpacking trips. emergency food, basic first aid items, repair materials, and leaving them cached in bear-proof containers at remote campsites. Not because I expect to see my helper again, but as a way of continuing the tradition of taking care of fellow travelers in the wilderness. Sometimes, the best partnerships are the ones where you never meet your partner face to face. I went to bed with no power and woke to find my broken generator running perfectly with repairs that showed master-level mechanical skill. I'd inherited a small off-grid cabin in Michigan's Upper Peninsula from my Uncle Frank, who'd built the place in the 1980s as a fishing retreat on the shore of Whitefish Bay. 40 acres of mixed forest, maybe 8 miles from the nearest neighbor, accessible only by a seasonal road that barely qualified for that description. The cabin was simple, but well designed. Solar panels for basic electricity, a propane system for heat and cooking, and a backup generator for emergencies or extended cloudy periods. Uncle Frank had been a mechanical engineer before he retired, and everything was built to last with quality components and careful maintenance. I'd been using the place as a weekend retreat for about 2 years, usually just spring through fall when the road was passable. But December had been unusually mild, and I decided to spend a long weekend at the cabin, even though we were well into what should have been serious winter weather. That decision looked questionable when the first major snowstorm of the season hit on Friday night. The storm came in fast and heavy, dumping maybe 18 inches of snow in 12 hours and knocking out my solar charging system completely. By Saturday morning, I was running on battery reserves that wouldn't last more than another day or two. No problem. That's exactly what the backup generator was for. I trudged through knee-deep snow to the generator shed, expecting to fire up the reliable Honda unit Uncle Frank had installed years earlier. The generator was dead, completely unresponsive. I spent most of Saturday morning troubleshooting the system. Checked the fuel supply, tested the battery, cleaned the spark plug, verified all the connections. Everything looked correct, but the engine wouldn't even turn over. The electric starter made a clicking sound that suggested a much deeper problem than simple maintenance could fix. By Saturday afternoon, I was facing the reality of spending at least 2 nights in a cabin with no heat and no electricity, with more snow forecast and no way to get out until the county plows cleared the seasonal road sometime early next week. I had enough firewood to keep the main room marginally warm and enough propane for basic cooking. It would be uncomfortable, but not dangerous if I managed resources carefully. I'd spent cold nights in worse conditions during my military service. Saturday night was exactly as miserable as I'd expected. The temperature inside the cabin dropped to maybe 40 degrees, despite keeping a fire going all night. I slept in my winter sleeping bag right next to the fireplace and woke up every couple of hours to feed the fire. Sunday morning, I was awakened by an unfamiliar sound. The steady hum of my generator running perfectly. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but the cabin lights were on, the refrigerator was running, and through the window I could see the external security light illuminating the snowy yard. The generator was definitely operational. I pulled on my boots and coat and trudged out to the generator shed to figure out what had happened. The Honda was running smoothly, showing no signs of the mechanical problems that had kept it dead the previous day. But it wasn't just running. It had been repaired with expertise that exceeded anything I could have achieved. The engine cover had been removed and reinstalled with all the bolts properly torqued. Internal components that I couldn't have accessed without specialized tools had been cleaned and adjusted. The air filter had been replaced with what looked like a custom modification using natural materials woven into an incredibly efficient filtration system. Most impressive was the fuel delivery system. The carburetor had been completely rebuilt using what appeared to be hand-machined parts made from materials I couldn't identify. The modifications improved fuel efficiency and power output beyond the unit's original specifications. Whoever had done this work possessed advanced mechanical knowledge, combined with access to fabrication techniques that seemed almost impossible in a remote wilderness setting. Walking around the generator shed, I found large prints in the snow, the familiar canine-shaped tracks I'd encountered in other situations. But these showed something new, clear evidence of tool use and extended work sessions. The snow around the shed had been systematically cleared to provide workspace. Tools from my shed had been borrowed and returned to their proper places, but arranged more efficiently than I'd ever organized them. Several improvised tools had been crafted from natural materials and left beside the generator, precision instruments that would have been useful for the complex repair work. Most significantly, the tool marks on the generator components showed evidence of opposable thumbs and fine motor control that suggested hands rather than paws. The repair work required not just intelligence, but genuine dexterity and mechanical aptitude. The generator continued running flawlessly throughout the rest of my stay. The fuel efficiency was so improved that my usual weekend supply of gasoline lasted the entire extended visit with fuel to spare. The engine ran quieter, started more reliably, and produced cleaner power than it had when Uncle Frank first installed it. When the county plow finally cleared the road Wednesday morning, I left a collection of supplies by the generator shed: high-quality motor oil, spare parts for small engines, some basic tools, and a bottle of decent whiskey. Everything was gone when I returned the following weekend. Over the following months, I established a pattern of leaving useful items during my visits: mechanical supplies, quality tools, reference manuals for small engine repair. The items would disappear, and I'd find evidence of ongoing maintenance and improvements to the cabin systems. The solar panel array was cleaned and realigned for better efficiency. The propane system received upgrades that improved both safety and performance. Even the cabin's water pump system was modified to run more quietly and reliably. It felt like having a maintenance partner who understood mechanical systems better than most professional technicians, but who preferred to work unseen and unacknowledged. The improvements benefited both of us. I got reliable systems, and whoever was helping got access to quality tools and materials. I've never seen my mysterious maintenance partner, though I've found fresh prints around the cabin after every visit. Large, canine-shaped tracks that circle the property and approach every mechanical system, but never come closer than about 20 feet to the cabin itself. The relationship works well for both parties. I provide supplies and respect boundaries, and my cabin systems receive maintenance that exceeds anything I could do myself. Uncle Frank would have appreciated the craftsmanship and attention to detail. Some partnerships don't require face-to-face meetings to be successful. The firewood I'd been meaning to stack for weeks was perfectly corded by morning, arranged with geometric precision. I'd been working night security at Northwoods lumber mill for about 6 months when this happened. The mill had shut down operations the previous spring due to market conditions, but the company kept me on to watch the equipment and prevent vandalism, while they decided whether to reopen or sell the facility. It was a decent job for someone who preferred working alone. 12-hour shifts walking the property, checking buildings, monitoring the few security cameras that still functioned, The mill sat on about 60 acres along the Chippewa River, surrounded by the kind of mixed hardwood forest that had made lumber operations profitable in northern Wisconsin for over a century. One of the perks of working at a lumber mill, even a closed one, was access to firewood. The company let employees take deadfall and mill scraps for personal use, and with winter coming on, I'd arranged to have 3 cords of split oak delivered to the employee parking area behind the main office. The delivery arrived on a Friday afternoon, just as I was starting my shift. The driver dumped the entire load in a pile next to my pickup truck, roughly 3 cords of mixed oak, maple and birch, all split and ready to burn but scattered in a heap that would take most of a weekend to stack properly. I'd planned to spend Saturday organizing the wood, but my sister called Friday night with a family emergency that kept me occupied all weekend. By Monday morning, the firewood was still sitting in a loose pile, and I was facing the prospect of spending my nights off doing manual labor instead of getting ready for deer season. Monday night, I mentioned the firewood situation to my supervisor during our weekly check-in call. Jerry Haugen lived about 40 miles away in Eau Claire and only visited the mill site once a month, but he liked to stay informed about any issues or concerns. "Take your time with it," Jerry said. "Company doesn't care as long as it doesn't interfere with your security duties. Stack it when you get a chance." But I never got the chance. Between family obligations and a part-time job I'd picked up to supplement my mill wages, weekends were packed with commitments that didn't leave time for splitting and stacking firewood. 3 weeks later, I arrived for my Monday night shift to find the wood perfectly stacked. Not just stacked, arranged in 3 precise cords that would have made a professional timber worker proud. Each cord measured exactly 4 feet high, 4 feet deep, and 8 feet long, with every piece positioned for optimal air circulation and weather protection. The stacking technique was flawless. Larger pieces formed the base and structural elements. Smaller pieces filled gaps without creating air pockets, and the entire arrangement was stable enough to withstand high winds without shifting. The bark side of each piece faced outward for weather resistance, and the ends were aligned so precisely they looked like they'd been cut with a laser. More impressive was the sorting. The oak, maple, and birch had been separated and stacked according to species, with the oak arranged for easiest access since it burned longest and hottest. Within each species, the wood was organized by size and quality, with the best pieces positioned for convenient selection. This wasn't amateur work. Whoever had done this understood wood seasoning, storage, and burning characteristics better than most people who'd been heating with wood their entire lives. Walking around the stacked wood, I found large prints in the soft earth around the pile. The familiar canine-shaped tracks, but these showed something new. Evidence of extended work sessions and tool use. Measurements had been taken using natural materials as measuring devices. Straight branches cut to 4-foot lengths. Smaller sticks marked at regular intervals for consistent spacing. The improvised tools were arranged neatly beside the wood stacks, ready for future use. Most significantly, the ground around each cord had been carefully prepared. Low spots had been filled with gravel from the mill's equipment yard, and drainage channels had been dug to direct water away from the wood storage areas. The preparation would keep the firewood dry and accessible even during spring snowmelt. I spent the rest of that week's shifts examining the work more carefully. Every detail showed intelligence, planning, and genuine care for the quality of the final product. This wasn't just someone doing me a favor. It was craftsmanship at a professional level. The following Monday, I left a thank you note and a 6-pack of good beer beside the wood stacks. Both were gone when I arrived for my Tuesday shift, along with the improvised measuring tools that had been left behind. Over the remaining months of my employment at the mill, similar assistance appeared sporadically. The employee parking area was cleared of snow with mathematical precision, arranged so every vehicle had easy access regardless of weather conditions. Some basic maintenance was performed on mill equipment that the company couldn't afford to service professionally. Nothing that would restart operations, but enough to prevent deterioration from weather and neglect. The security cameras occasionally malfunctioned during the hours when this work was being done, but I never reported the outages to Jerry. Some things are better left undocumented, especially when they're beneficial to everyone involved. When Northwoods Lumber finally sold the facility to a development company in the spring, I cleaned out my security office and left a collection of tools and supplies beside the firewood stacks. Quality hand tools, some materials for basic equipment maintenance, and a note thanking my anonymous helper for making a lonely job more bearable. Everything was gone the next morning, along with the firewood I hadn't used over the winter. I hope whoever bought the property appreciates having such a conscientious neighbor in the surrounding forest. Good partnerships are rare, and the ones that work without requiring formal agreements are the most valuable of all. I woke to find my planned hiking route marked with trail signs that warned of hazards no human could have detected. I'd planned a 3-day solo backpacking loop through the Superior National Forest in northern Minnesota, following a route I'd pieced together from topographic maps and online trail reports. The plan was to hike about 12 miles per day through some of the most remote wilderness in the lower 48 states. This wasn't official trail system hiking. I was planning to use a combination of old logging roads, game trails, and cross-country navigation to complete a rough triangle that would bring me back to my starting point at the Forest Road 166 trailhead. I'd done similar trips before, but this route was more ambitious. Longer daily distances, more challenging terrain, and sections where I'd be completely dependent on map and compass navigation. The kind of trip that requires careful planning and good judgment to avoid serious problems. The first day went perfectly. 8 miles of hiking through mixed pine and hardwood forest, following an old logging road that showed up clearly on my 1970s topo maps, but had mostly grown over in the decades since timber operations ended. I made good time and set up camp at a small clearing near what my map showed as Beaver Creek. That evening, I spread out my maps and GPS unit to plan the next day's route. Day 2 would be the most challenging. About 10 miles of cross-country hiking through an area with no established trails, including a creek crossing and a climb over a significant ridgeline. I marked my planned route with a highlighter, identified key navigation waypoints, and double-checked my compass bearings for the morning departure. Everything looked straightforward on paper, though I knew the reality of cross-country navigation could be more complicated than topographic maps suggested. I went to sleep confident in my planning and looking forward to the challenge of navigating virgin wilderness. Morning brought a surprise that changed everything. My planned route had been marked overnight with trail signs unlike anything I'd seen in 40 years of wilderness hiking. They weren't official Forest Service markers or standard trailblazers. These were custom signs made from natural materials, flat pieces of birch bark with symbols carved or burned into the surface, mounted on straight branches at exactly eye level. The first marker, maybe 50 yards from my tent, showed a simple pictogram of wavy lines with an X marked over them. Below the symbol was an arrow pointing about 30 degrees east of my planned route. I followed the arrow to the next marker, which showed a more complex symbol, what looked like a person falling, with jagged lines beneath. Another arrow, continuing to redirect me away from my original planned route. The third marker was the most explicit. It showed a detailed drawing of what was clearly meant to be unstable ground, cracked earth with a figure sinking into it. The arrow pointed toward a route that would take me well around whatever hazard was being indicated. I spent the morning following the markers rather than my original plan, curious to see what hazards they were warning me about. What I found changed my understanding of wilderness navigation completely. My planned route would have taken me across what looked like solid ground, but was actually a section of boggy muskeg hidden under a thin layer of moss and fallen leaves. I only discovered this when I approached from the side and saw how my boots sank through what appeared to be firm forest floor. If I'd been following my original route with a full pack in poor visibility, I could easily have ended up waist deep in boggy water miles from help. The markers had directed me around a potentially serious problem that wouldn't have been obvious until I was already in trouble. The creek crossing my maps indicated turned out to be much more dangerous than anticipated. Spring runoff had undermined the banks, creating a situation where the water was deeper and faster than it appeared from a distance. The markers led me upstream to a much safer crossing point, where the creek split into multiple shallow channels. Each marker location showed large prints in the soft earth, the familiar canine-shaped tracks, but these demonstrated something remarkable. The tracks approached each hazard from multiple directions, suggesting systematic scouting and evaluation. Whoever placed these markers had done careful reconnaissance of the terrain and identified problems a casual hiker would never notice. The alternative route suggested by the markers turned out to be not just safer, but more scenic than my original plan. Instead of struggling through boggy ground and dangerous water crossings, I found myself following game trails through sections of old-growth forest that didn't appear on any of my maps. The markers continued throughout the day, always appearing just when I needed navigation guidance. They led me around obstacles, pointed out the safest creek crossings, and directed me to a perfect campsite for the second night. A sheltered spot with fresh water and excellent drainage that I never would have found on my own. That evening, I noticed that the morning's markers had disappeared. Every sign that had guided me around the muskeg and dangerous creek crossing was gone, removed so completely that I couldn't even find the holes where the mounting stakes had been placed. But new markers appeared the next morning for day 3 of my loop. The final day's navigation was even more impressive. The markers led me along a route that avoided 2 significant hazards my maps hadn't indicated. A section where recent storms had created dangerous deadfall, and an area where beaver activity had flooded what should have been dry ground. More remarkably, the final series of markers led me to a scenic overlook that provided spectacular views of the Boundary Waters area. The viewpoint wasn't marked on any map or mentioned in any trail guide I'd ever seen, but it offered some of the finest wilderness vistas I'd experienced in decades of hiking. I completed the loop in perfect safety, having covered 36 miles of challenging terrain without a single serious navigation error or dangerous encounter. The trip that should have been my most demanding solo hike became one of my most enjoyable and safest wilderness experiences. On my final morning, I left a thank you note and some quality trail mix at the trailhead, weighted down with a small stone so it wouldn't blow away. When I returned to load my gear, both the note and the food were gone. I've been back to that area several times since then, but I've never seen the custom trail markers again. I've also never attempted that particular route without proper preparation and respect for the hazards I now know are hidden in what appears to be straightforward wilderness terrain. Some of the best wilderness guidance comes from sources that know the land better than any map or GPS unit ever could. I forgot to remove my dock before winter and found it professionally winterized just hours before the ice storm. I'd inherited my grandmother's lake house on Pine Lake in northern Wisconsin when she passed the previous summer. Grandma Ruth had owned the place for 40 years and knew everything about maintaining a seasonal property in a climate where winter could destroy anything left unprepared. Unfortunately, her knowledge hadn't transferred to me along with the deed. It was my first winter as the property owner, and I'd been learning the hard way that lake houses require different maintenance schedules than suburban homes. By early December, I was already behind on several critical winterization tasks, most notably removing the aluminum dock system that extended about 30 feet into the lake. Grandma Ruth had always hired the Kowalski brothers from town to handle dock installation and removal, but this year I'd procrastinated until it was too late. The Kowalskis were booked solid through Christmas, and the weather had turned cold enough that working in the water would require dry suits and professional equipment I didn't have access to. I'd resigned myself to leaving the dock in place and hoping for the best. Maybe the ice formation would be gentle this year. Maybe the aluminum frame was strong enough to handle some ice pressure. Maybe I'd get lucky and avoid the thousands of dollars in damage that everyone warned me about. The weather forecast for the second week of December eliminated any hope of getting lucky. A massive ice storm was tracking toward northern Wisconsin, expected to arrive Thursday night with freezing rain, high winds, and the kind of ice accumulation that destroys everything in its path. Trees, power lines, and definitely aluminum dock systems that should have been removed months earlier. Wednesday evening, I drove up to the lake house to secure what I could and wait for the destruction. The dock looked fragile and doomed in the grey December light, ice already forming around the support posts closest to shore. I went to bed Wednesday night listening to freezing rain beginning to tap against the bedroom windows, knowing I'd wake up to expensive damage and a valuable lesson about procrastination in northern climates. Thursday morning, I woke to the sound of my generator running smoothly and the sight of my dock system professionally winterized. Not just removed, completely and expertly winterized using techniques that would have impressed the Kowalski brothers. Every section of the aluminum frame had been disassembled in the correct sequence and stored in my boat shed using proper spacing and support techniques. The deck planks were stacked with spacers between each board for air circulation, arranged to prevent warping and splitting during the freeze-thaw cycles of a Wisconsin winter. All the hardware, bolts, brackets, cleats, everything, had been cleaned, sorted by size and type, and stored in clearly labeled containers. The support posts had been pulled from their lake bottom sockets and arranged vertically against the shed wall, positioned to drain completely and avoid freeze damage. More impressive was the attention to detail. Each aluminum section had been cleaned of algae and water stains, something I'd never thought to do, but that would prevent corrosion during storage. The electrical connections for the dock lights had been properly disconnected and weatherproofed. Even the wooden storage boxes had been emptied, cleaned, and repositioned to prevent moisture damage. The work showed professional knowledge of marine construction and winter storage techniques that exceeded anything I could have achieved even with proper planning and equipment. Walking around the dock area, I found large prints in the thin layer of snow and ice that had accumulated during the storm. The tracks showed systematic movement around every part of the dock system, suggesting hours of careful work completed in conditions that would have been dangerous for any human. The prints approached the water's edge at multiple points, indicating that someone had worked in freezing water during the worst of the ice storm. The dedication required to complete such physically demanding work in dangerous weather conditions was remarkable. Inside the boat shed, I found evidence of tool use and organization that suggested opposable thumbs and fine motor control. My own tools had been borrowed and returned, but arranged more efficiently than I'd ever organized them. Several improvised tools had been crafted for specific tasks, specialized wrenches made from natural materials, perfectly shaped for the unique hardware on my particular dock system. The ice storm continued through Thursday night and into Friday morning, coating everything with nearly an inch of clear ice. Trees snapped under the weight, power lines came down throughout the county, and several neighbors lost docks and boat lifts to ice damage. My dock system, safely stored in the shed, suffered no damage at all. Spring dock installation was remarkably easy. When the Kowalski brothers finally had time to reinstall my system in May, they commented on the quality of the winter storage and the excellent condition of all the components. Whoever winterized this did professional quality work, Tom Kowalski said. Everything's labeled, organized, and stored exactly right. Made our job about twice as fast as usual. I just nodded and let them assume I'd hired someone else to handle the winterization. Over the following winters, I established a pattern of attempting to handle seasonal maintenance myself, but always finding that the most critical tasks had been completed professionally when severe weather threatened. My snow removal was handled during the worst storms, always cleared with precision that exceeded what any plow service could have achieved. Ice damage prevention continued throughout each winter, with problems addressed before they could become expensive repairs. I started leaving winter maintenance supplies in the boat shed, quality marine lubricants, replacement hardware, tools specifically designed for dock maintenance. The supplies would disappear over the winter months, and my dock system continued to receive maintenance that kept it in better condition than most docks half its age. The arrangement works well for everyone involved. I provide materials and respect boundaries, and my lake house receives winter care that exceeds anything I could do myself or afford to hire professionally. Grandma Ruth would have appreciated having such a conscientious neighbor looking after her property. I woke to find 3 days' worth of perfectly seasoned firewood stacked beside my tent after the storm ruined my supply. I'd planned a 4-day backpacking trip through the Porcupine Mountains Wilderness State Park in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, following the Lake Superior Trail along the most remote section of the park's backcountry. October, hiking in the Porcupines. Challenging terrain, spectacular fall colors, and the kind of solitude you can't find in more popular wilderness areas. The weather forecast had called for partly cloudy skies with maybe a chance of light showers later in the week. Typical Upper Peninsula autumn weather, nothing that should have caused problems for an experienced backpacker with proper rain gear. Forecasts in the Upper Peninsula can be wildly optimistic. I was 2 days into the trip, camped at a backcountry site about 6 miles from the nearest trailhead, when the storm hit with no warning. What started as light rain around dinner time became a full-scale thunderstorm, with horizontal precipitation and wind gusts that had me seriously worried about treefall. The storm lasted most of the night, dumping maybe 4 inches of rain and turning every low spot in the forest into a temporary lake. My tent held up fine, but everything outside got absolutely soaked, including my carefully prepared supply of split firewood that I'd been depending on for warmth and cooking. By morning, my 3-day supply of seasoned hardwood was completely waterlogged. Not just damp, but saturated to the point where it wouldn't burn even with the best fire-starting techniques. I was facing 2 more nights in near-freezing temperatures without any reliable heat source. The situation wasn't immediately dangerous. I had adequate clothing and a good sleeping bag, but it would be miserable and potentially risky if the weather stayed cold and wet. More importantly, I couldn't cook properly without a fire, which meant rationing food and dealing with poor nutrition for the remainder of the trip. I spent most of that morning trying to find dry wood in the saturated forest. Everything was soaked through, from the smallest twigs to the largest deadfall. Even wood that looked promising on the outside was waterlogged when I split it open. By afternoon, I was seriously considering hiking out early rather than spending 2 more nights without fire. The trail conditions were muddy and treacherous after the storm, but it was better than being cold and hungry in a wet forest. That decision became unnecessary when I woke up the next morning. Someone had stacked 3 days' worth of perfectly dry seasoned firewood beside my tent while I slept. Not random pieces of forest deadfall, but quality split hardwood that had been properly seasoned for optimal burning. The stack included everything I needed: fine kindling for fire starting, medium pieces for building up heat, and larger splits that would burn for hours with minimal attention. The wood quality was remarkable. Each piece had been selected for specific burning characteristics and arranged in order of use. The kindling was bone dry and split thin enough to catch fire immediately. The larger pieces were dense hardwood that would produce steady heat and long-lasting coals perfect for cooking. Most impressive was the species selection. The stack contained a mixture of oak, maple, birch, and what looked like cherry. Exactly the combination an experienced woodsman would choose for camp heating and cooking. Each species had different burning properties, and they were arranged to take advantage of those characteristics. Walking around my campsite, I found large prints in the mud left by the previous night's rain. The familiar canine-shaped tracks, but these showed something remarkable. A systematic pattern that suggested careful scouting and selection of the best available deadfall. Following the tracks backward from my campsite, I found the source area about 100 yards away in a section of forest where storm damage had brought down several large maples. But this wasn't random scavenging. The harvesting showed intelligent selection of the driest, most suitable pieces. Only the deadfall that would burn cleanly had been taken. Punky wood was left untouched, green wood was ignored completely, and even the dry pieces were selected based on size and burning characteristics. It was the kind of wood selection that takes years of experience to master. The firewood continued appearing throughout the remainder of my trip. Each morning, I'd find my supply replenished with exactly what I needed for that day's cooking and heating requirements. Never too much, never too little. Always perfectly matched to my actual needs. The final morning, I found something extra in the wood stack. Several pieces of what looked like paper birch bark, but processed in a way I'd never seen. The bark had been treated somehow to make it an incredibly effective fire starter, better than any commercial tinder I'd ever used. I spent my last day experimenting with different cooking techniques using the superior firewood. The heat was consistent, the coals lasted for hours, and the smoke production was minimal. It was better than anything I could have brought from home or purchased commercially. Before hiking out, I left a significant portion of my remaining food supplies beside the fire ring. Quality trail meals, energy bars, and some coffee that I thought my mysterious helper might appreciate. I also left a note of thanks, though I suspected it would disappear like everything else. Everything was gone when I packed up my tent the next morning. The hike out was uneventful, but I found myself looking back frequently at the forest, where I'd received such thoughtful assistance. The help hadn't just made my trip more comfortable, it had taught me about wood selection and fire management techniques that I've used on every camping trip since. I've been back to the Porcupine Mountains several times, though never to that exact area. Part of me hopes to encounter my helpful neighbor again, but part of me thinks some experiences are meant to be unique. Either way, I've never taken firewood for granted since that trip, and I always carry extra food supplies, just in case I meet someone else who could use a helping hand in the wilderness. My radio transmitter died during the storm, and I found it running perfectly with repairs that defied explanation. I'd been working as a maintenance technician for Northland Broadcasting for about 2 years, responsible for keeping their network of rural radio towers operational across northern Wisconsin. It was mostly routine work, checking transmitter readings, replacing worn components, and ensuring compliance with FCC regulations. The job required me to visit each tower site monthly, but Tower 7 was special. It was our most remote installation, about 30 miles northeast of Rhinelander, accessible only by a seasonal forest road that became impassable during winter months. The site served a large area with limited broadcast coverage, making it critical for emergency communications and weather alerts. Tower 7 was also our most problematic installation. Built in the 1970s with equipment that had been upgraded piecemeal over the decades, it was a maintenance nightmare that required constant attention. The combination of aging electronics, harsh weather exposure, and remote location made it a challenging assignment that most technicians avoided. I was scheduled for a routine maintenance visit on a Thursday evening in late September, planning to check transmitter performance and replace some aging components that had been giving us intermittent problems. The weather forecast called for possible thunderstorms, but nothing severe enough to delay the service call. I should have paid more attention to that forecast. The storm hit just as I was finishing my initial equipment checks around 9 p.m. What started as distant thunder became a full-scale electrical storm, with lightning strikes close enough to make the tower guy wires hum with induced current. I was buttoning up the transmitter building and preparing to leave when a lightning strike hit close enough to light up the entire facility like noon. The electrical surge that followed knocked out our primary transmitter completely. Not just a blown fuse or tripped breaker, complete failure. The main power supply was dead, the RF amplifier stages were fried, and the control circuits were showing no signs of life. It was the kind of catastrophic failure that would require weeks of parts orders and expensive repairs. I spent another hour documenting the damage and trying basic troubleshooting procedures, but the situation was hopeless. The transmitter would need major component replacement and probably a complete rebuild of the power supply system. I called my supervisor from the site landline to report the situation. Dave Hendricks wasn't happy about losing our most important rural coverage, but he understood that lightning damage was beyond anyone's control. "Do what you can to secure the site," Dave said. "We'll have to order parts and maybe bring in a contractor for the rebuild. Probably looking at 2 weeks minimum downtime." I locked up the equipment building and drove back to Rhinelander through the continuing storm, already dreading the paperwork and parts procurement headaches ahead. 2 days later, I got a call from Dave that changed everything. "Tower 7's back on the air," he said. "Signal stronger than it's been in years." "When did you complete the repairs?" I told him I hadn't completed any repairs. The transmitter had been completely dead when I left the site Thursday night. Dave was quiet for a moment. "Well, somebody fixed it, and they did a hell of a job. Signal strength is up 20% over normal, and the audio quality is better than when the station was first built." I drove back to Tower 7 that afternoon, expecting to find that Dave had sent another technician to handle the emergency repairs. What I found was impossible. The transmitter was indeed running perfectly, but the repairs went far beyond anything in our standard procedures manual. The damaged power supply had been rebuilt using components I'd never seen before. Custom circuits that seemed to be made from materials that weren't in any electronics catalog. The RF amplifier stages had been not just repaired, but upgraded with modifications that improved efficiency and reduced heat generation. The control circuits were operating with precision that exceeded the original equipment specifications. Most remarkable were the surge protection modifications. Someone had installed lightning protection systems using techniques and components that were more advanced than anything our engineering department had access to. The modifications would prevent the kind of damage we'd just experienced, but using methods I couldn't identify or understand. Walking around the equipment building, I found large prints in the muddy ground around the facility. The storm had left soft earth that showed clear impressions of the canine-shaped tracks I was becoming familiar with from other encounters. Inside the transmitter building, the evidence of precise electronic work was everywhere. Components had been removed and reinstalled with perfect technique. Solder joints were cleaner than anything I could achieve with professional equipment. Even the wire routing was improved, following optimal paths that reduced interference and improved cooling. The test equipment showed performance levels that exceeded factory specifications. Power output was higher but more stable. Harmonic distortion was reduced to levels I'd never seen on aging equipment, and the automatic control systems were operating with precision that suggested custom programming. I spent several hours documenting the modifications, though I couldn't explain how they'd been accomplished or where the components had come from. The work showed knowledge of RF engineering that exceeded most college-level programs, combined with access to materials and fabrication techniques that weren't available through normal supply channels. Over the following months, Tower 7 became our most reliable installation. The modified equipment operated flawlessly through severe weather that caused problems at other sites. The enhanced lightning protection prevented damage during subsequent storms, and the improved efficiency reduced our power consumption significantly. Other technicians started asking me about the upgrades at Tower 7, assuming I'd implemented some new maintenance procedures or gotten access to better replacement parts. I never corrected their assumptions, though I made sure to leave quality electronic components and reference materials at the site during subsequent visits. The components would disappear, and the equipment would continue receiving maintenance that exceeded anything our regular service procedures could provide. Minor problems were corrected before they could cause outages, and preventive modifications were implemented before issues developed. Dave eventually recommended me for a promotion based on the improved performance of my installation at Tower 7. I accepted the recognition, though I knew the real credit belonged to someone with skills far exceeding my own. The arrangement has continued for 3 years now. Tower 7 remains our flagship installation, operating with reliability and performance that makes it a model for the entire network. I continue providing materials and respect for whoever maintains the site, and our rural coverage remains the best it's ever been. Some partnerships work best when the details remain private. My cabin roof had been leaking for months, and I found it completely waterproof just hours before the blizzard. I'd inherited my grandfather's hunting cabin in the Upper Peninsula the previous spring, along with all the maintenance headaches that come with a structure built in the 1950s, using materials and techniques that were already outdated. The cabin sat on 40 acres of mixed timber, about 12 miles from the nearest neighbor, accessible only by a 2-track road that became impassable during serious winter weather. The most urgent problem was the roof. Decades of harsh UP winters had taken their toll on the original cedar shingles and underlying structure. I'd been patching leaks all summer and fall, but the fundamental problem was beyond my skills and definitely beyond my budget. A proper roof repair would cost more than I could afford, especially with the cabin's remote location driving up labor costs significantly. Every roofing contractor I'd contacted wanted premium rates for the isolated job site, and most wouldn't commit to scheduling before spring. I'd been hoping to get through one more winter with temporary patches and strategic bucket placement, but the weather forecast for the second week of December eliminated any chance of that plan working. The National Weather Service was tracking a major Alberta clipper system that promised to dump 3 feet of snow on the Upper Peninsula over a 48-hour period, with wind gusts strong enough to stress any structure with existing weaknesses. My cabin roof, with its multiple patches and questionable structural integrity, was exactly the kind of weak point that would fail catastrophically under that kind of snow load. Tuesday evening, I drove up to the cabin to secure what I could before the storm hit. The plan was to shut off the water, move valuable items to the strongest part of the structure, and hope the roof held together long enough for spring repairs. Walking around the cabin in the grey December light, the roof looked even worse than I'd remembered. Several areas were showing obvious sag, and I could see daylight through gaps in the shingles that no amount of patching would fix. I went to bed Tuesday night listening to the wind pick up and the first snowflakes beginning to tap against the bedroom window, resigned to waking up with a collapsed roof and thousands of dollars in damage I couldn't afford to repair. Wednesday morning, I woke to the sound of wind howling through the trees and snow hitting the windows horizontally. The blizzard had arrived with the intensity the forecasters had predicted, but my roof wasn't leaking. Not just the absence of new leaks. All the existing problem areas had been completely waterproofed overnight. Every weak spot I'd been worried about was now structurally sound and properly sealed against weather penetration. I spent the morning examining the work from inside the cabin, amazed by the quality and scope of the repairs. This wasn't emergency patching. It was professional-grade roofing work that addressed both immediate problems and underlying structural issues I hadn't even been aware of. The most impressive repairs were in the areas where snow load had been a concern. Support beams had been reinforced using materials that appeared to be locally sourced timber, but processed and installed with techniques that exceeded most professional contractors. The reinforcements weren't just functional, they were engineered to distribute weight more effectively than the original roof design. The modifications would handle snow loads far exceeding anything the old structure could have managed. Outside, despite the blizzard conditions, I found large prints in the snow around the entire cabin perimeter. The tracks showed systematic movement around every part of the roofline, suggesting hours of careful work completed in weather conditions that would have been dangerous for any human. The prints approached the cabin from multiple directions and showed evidence of tool transport and material staging, but the work had been completed during the worst possible conditions: horizontal snow, sub-zero temperatures, and wind gusts that would have made ladder work extremely hazardous. More remarkable was the material selection. The reinforcing timber appeared to be locally harvested, but it was processed with precision that suggested access to professional-grade tools and extensive knowledge of construction techniques. The original cedar shingles had been supplemented with what looked like hand-split material that matched the existing roof perfectly, but provided superior weather protection. The integration was so seamless that from ground level, the repairs were almost invisible. The blizzard continued for 2 days, dumping 38 inches of snow and testing every structure in the region. Several neighbors lost outbuildings to the storm, and even newer constructions suffered damage from the combination of snow load and high winds. My cabin roof performed flawlessly. No leaks, no sagging, no signs of stress despite carrying more snow than it had ever supported in its 70-year history. When the storm finally passed and I could get outside safely, I found more evidence of the remarkable repair work. The materials and techniques used showed understanding of traditional construction methods combined with modern engineering principles. The roof drainage had been improved with guttering systems made from materials I couldn't identify, but that directed water and ice away from the foundation more effectively than anything I could have installed professionally. Even the chimney had received attention. Mortar joints were repointed, and the cap was modified to prevent downdrafts and ice damming. I spent the rest of that winter watching my improved roof handle everything the Upper Peninsula could deliver. Ice storms, multiple heavy snow loads, and freeze-thaw cycles that destroyed neighboring structures had no effect on my expertly repaired cabin. Before leaving in the spring, I left a collection of construction materials and quality tools in the woodshed: lumber, hardware, roofing materials, and some specialty tools that might be useful for ongoing maintenance. Everything was gone when I returned the following fall, but the cabin had received additional improvements throughout the summer. The foundation had been repointed, several windows had been resealed, and the electrical system had been upgraded with safety modifications that exceeded current building codes. The partnership has continued for 5 years now. I provide materials and respect boundaries, and my grandfather's cabin receives maintenance that keeps it in better condition than most structures half its age. I've learned to appreciate having a neighbor who takes genuine pride in quality craftsmanship and understands the challenges of maintaining an isolated structure in harsh climates. The fog had me completely disoriented until distant howls began leading me toward the portage I'd missed. I'd planned a 5-day solo canoe trip through the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness in northern Minnesota, following a route I'd researched for months that would take me through some of the most remote lakes in the system. September in the Boundary Waters, minimal crowds, stable weather, and the beginning of fall colors that make the region spectacular. The route was ambitious for a solo paddler, about 60 miles total, with 12 portages ranging from easy carries to challenging climbs over ridgelines between lake systems. I'd done similar trips before, but this one pushed into areas I'd never explored, relying on topographic maps and GPS navigation to find portages that weren't well marked on the ground. Everything went perfectly for the first 3 days. I made good time, found all the portages without problems, and camped at sites that offered the kind of solitude that makes BWCA trips so valuable. The weather was ideal: clear skies, light winds, and temperatures that made paddling comfortable without being too warm for the physical work. The fourth morning brought unexpected complications. I woke to find my lake completely socked in with fog so dense I couldn't see the shoreline from my campsite. Not unusual for September mornings in northern Minnesota, but typically the fog burns off quickly once the sun gets some strength. This fog was different. It stayed thick throughout the morning and seemed to be getting denser rather than clearing. By noon, visibility was down to maybe 20 yards, making navigation extremely difficult in a lake system where many bodies of water look identical even in clear conditions. I decided to paddle anyway, figuring I could follow the shoreline until I found the portage that would take me to my next destination. My map showed it should be on the north end of the lake, marked by a small creek inlet that was usually easy to identify. That was my first mistake. In the fog, every shoreline feature looked the same. Small bays that seemed to match my map turned out to be dead ends. Creek inlets that looked promising led to beaver dams rather than portage trails. Within 2 hours of paddling, I was completely disoriented and no longer confident I even knew which lake I was on. My GPS unit, which had been reliable throughout the trip, started showing erratic readings in the fog. The satellite reception was compromised somehow, giving me position fixes that jumped around by hundreds of yards between readings. My compass seemed to be working, but without clear landmarks to take bearings on, it wasn't much help for navigation. By mid-afternoon, I was genuinely lost in one of North America's most challenging wilderness areas, with fog that showed no signs of clearing and navigation tools that weren't functioning properly. That's when I heard the first howl. It came from somewhere ahead of me in the fog, maybe a quarter mile away. A long, mournful call that echoed across the water before fading into the thick air. At first, I figured it was probably a wolf, common enough in the boundary waters, though they usually avoid areas with human activity. The second howl came from the same direction, but this one had a different quality. 2 tones harmonizing together, like the sound I'd heard from Dogman in previous encounters. The complexity of the vocalization was unlike anything a wolf would produce. More importantly, the calls seemed to be coming from the direction I needed to travel based on my best guess at navigation. If my map reading was correct, the portage should be roughly northeast of my current position, and the howls were coming from that general bearing. I decided to follow the sounds, figuring that any landmark was better than paddling randomly through the fog. Even if the howls weren't intentional guidance, they might lead me to shoreline features that would help with navigation. The calls continued every few minutes, always from ahead of me and always from the same general direction. As I paddled toward them, the howls seemed to move, staying just at the edge of my hearing range, but maintaining a consistent bearing that pulled me northeast across the lake. After maybe an hour of following the calls, I began to recognize the shoreline features. The rocky points and small islands matched what my map showed for the area near the portage I'd been looking for. The howls led me directly to a narrow inlet I'd missed during my earlier searching. The inlet looked insignificant from the water, just a gap in the reeds that could easily be overlooked in good visibility, let alone in dense fog. But following the creek upstream for maybe 50 yards brought me to the portage trail I'd been seeking for hours. The path was well marked once I found it, with clear signs of regular use and blazes that would guide me to the next lake in my planned route. The howl stopped as soon as I reached the portage. I spent the rest of that afternoon completing the carry and setting up camp at a familiar lake where the fog was beginning to thin. The navigation assistance had been perfectly timed and remarkably accurate, leading me to exactly the right location when my own tools had failed. Walking around the portage area, I found large prints in the muddy trail, the canine-shaped tracks I had learned to recognize from other helpful encounters. The prints showed movement along the shoreline in exactly the pattern that would have allowed someone to guide a lost canoe paddler from a position of high ground. The tracks approached the water at several points, suggesting that my guide had been monitoring my progress and adjusting the calling locations to keep me moving in the correct direction. Most remarkably, the prints showed evidence of systematic scouting. The tracks circled the entire area around the portage, as if someone had been evaluating the terrain and identifying the best route for guiding a confused paddler through challenging navigation. The final day of my trip was uneventful, with clear weather and straightforward navigation back to my departure point. But I spent considerable time thinking about the precision of the assistance I'd received. The howls hadn't just been random animal vocalizations. They'd been deliberate guidance from someone who understood both the lake system and the specific navigation problem I was facing. The calls had led me to the exact portage I needed, using a route that was more direct than anything I would have found through trial and error. Before loading my canoe for the drive home, I left a collection of quality wilderness food and some basic camping supplies at the departure point. I also left a note of thanks, though I suspected it would disappear like similar gestures in other encounters. Everything was gone when the outfitter arrived to pick up other departing groups later that day. I've been back to the boundary waters many times since then, though I've never experienced navigation problems severe enough to require assistance. But I've heard similar stories from other solo paddlers, accounts of being guided to safety by sounds that seemed almost too convenient to be coincidental. The wilderness takes care of those who respect it, sometimes in ways that exceed our understanding of what's possible. My fire hazard maps were a disorganized mess, and I found them arranged in a system that predicted danger zones perfectly. I'd been working as night dispatcher for the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources Fire Control Station in Rhinelander for about 18 months, handling emergency calls and coordinating fire suppression resources across 3 counties in the Northwoods region. It was peak fire season, late August, with drought conditions and high temperatures creating the kind of tinderbox situation that keeps forestry personnel awake at night. My job was to monitor weather stations, track fire danger indices, and maintain situational awareness across hundreds of thousands of acres of mixed forest. The problem was information overload. Fire danger reports came in hourly from weather stations scattered throughout the region. Moisture readings, wind data, temperature trends, fuel condition assessments, all critical information that needed to be processed, analyzed, and used to update risk maps that guided patrol assignments and resource allocation. In theory, we had computer systems to handle the data integration. In practice, budget constraints and outdated equipment meant I was managing most of the analysis manually, using paper maps, printed reports, and a filing system that had grown increasingly chaotic as the fire season intensified. By late August, my desk looked like a paper explosion. Fire danger maps from different dates were mixed together, weather reports were scattered across multiple folders, and critical updates were buried in stacks of documentation that I no longer had time to organize properly. The system was failing exactly when we needed it most. Wednesday night brought the crisis that exposed how dysfunctional my information management had become. Around 2 a.m., I got a call from a DNR patrol reporting smoke visible from Tower Rock, about 15 miles northeast of town, potential wildfire in drought conditions, and I needed to quickly assess the risk factors for that specific area: fuel conditions, recent weather patterns, access routes for suppression crews, and proximity to structures or other high-value resources. The information was somewhere in my chaos of paperwork, but finding it quickly enough to guide an effective response was impossible. I spent 20 valuable minutes searching through disorganized files while a potential fire situation developed in real time. We got lucky. The smoke turned out to be a legal burn pile that had rekindled, not a wildfire. But the incident highlighted how badly I needed to organize my reference materials before a real emergency developed. I left the fire station around 7 a.m. after the day shift arrived, frustrated with my inability to manage the information systems effectively. The next night, I planned to spend my quiet hours reorganizing everything into a system that would support quick decision-making during emergencies. Thursday night, I arrived at the station to find my information management problem solved completely. Every fire danger map was organized chronologically and geographically, arranged in a system that made historical patterns immediately visible. Weather reports were sorted by station and date, with summary sheets that highlighted trends and anomalies relevant to fire risk assessment. More impressive was the analytical work. Someone had cross-referenced weather data with fuel condition reports to create risk assessments that were more comprehensive than anything our official systems produced. The analysis identified high danger zones that weren't obvious from individual data sources, but became clear when multiple factors were integrated properly. The organization wasn't just functional, it was revelatory. Patterns emerged from the properly sorted data that I'd never noticed before. Microclimates that consistently showed higher fire danger, elevation zones where fuel conditions were more critical, historical areas where fires had occurred repeatedly under specific weather conditions. Walking around the fire station, I found large prints in the soft earth outside the building. The track circled the entire facility and approached every window that provided a view of my desk area, suggesting extended observation of my work and information management challenges. Inside the station, the evidence showed systematic document analysis that went far beyond simple organization. Margin notes in precise handwriting pointed out correlations between different data sets. Cross-references connected related reports that I'd never thought to compare. The handwriting was clearly non-human, too precise, too consistent, with letter forms that suggested someone unaccustomed to human writing implements, but intelligent enough to communicate complex, analytical insights. Most remarkably, the organized system predicted fire dangers with accuracy that exceeded our official forecasting methods. Areas identified as high risk in the reorganized analysis match perfectly with actual fire incidents that occurred over the following weeks. The improved information management transformed my effectiveness as a night dispatcher. Response times for fire calls improved dramatically when I could quickly access relevant data. Resource allocation became more efficient when I could identify high-risk areas before problems developed. My supervisor, Karen Mills, noticed the improvement during our monthly performance review. "Whatever you changed in your information systems is working," she said. "Your situational awareness has improved significantly, and your risk assessments have been more accurate than anyone else in the district." I accepted the recognition without explaining the source of the organizational improvements. Over the remainder of that fire season, the mysterious assistance continued. New reports were integrated into the existing systems seamlessly. Analytical updates appeared overnight, and the predictive accuracy continued to exceed anything our official methods produced. The assistance extended beyond paperwork. Equipment that I'd been too busy to maintain was serviced overnight. Radios calibrated, computers cleaned and optimized. Filing systems expanded to accommodate growing information requirements. I started leaving reference materials and analytical tools at the station. Quality maps, weather monitoring equipment, office supplies that might be useful for ongoing information management. Everything would be used appropriately and maintained in excellent condition. The partnership lasted throughout my tenure at the Rhinelander station. When I transferred to a different position 2 years later, I left detailed documentation of the organizational systems and analytical methods that had made the fire program so effective. My replacement reported that the information management systems continued operating smoothly, though he never understood exactly how the analytical work was being completed. Forest fire prevention benefits from all available expertise, regardless of its source. November caught me unprepared for winter, and I found my entire homestead professionally winterized by morning. I'd moved to a 40-acre homestead in northern Minnesota the previous spring, buying a property about 8 miles from Grand Marais that had been partially developed by the previous owners, but needed significant work to make it fully functional for year-round living. The property included a main house built in the 1980s, a large pole barn for equipment storage, several smaller outbuildings, and infrastructure that was more complex than anything I'd managed before. Solar power system with battery bank, backup generators, deep well pump with pressure tank, modern septic system, and multiple heating zones that each required specific seasonal preparation. My first Minnesota winter was proving to be a learning experience that I wasn't handling very well. I'd spent the summer and early fall working on obvious projects, insulating the crawl space, upgrading windows, improving the wood heating system. But by early November, I was overwhelmed by the amount of winterization work that still needed to be completed before serious cold arrived. Each system on the property had specific requirements that I was learning about for the first time, often by discovering problems that should have been prevented weeks earlier. The solar system needed battery maintenance and charge controller adjustments for low winter sun angles. The backup generators required fuel system preparation, exercise routines, and cold weather modifications. The well pump system needed freeze protection measures that went far beyond what I'd expected. The septic system required pumping, bacterial treatment, and drain field preparation. Even the livestock water systems in the barn needed heating elements and backup power connections. I'd been tackling projects one at a time, but each task seemed to reveal 3 more problems that required immediate attention. By the first week of November, my list of critical winterization work was growing faster than I could complete it. The weather forecast for the second week of November eliminated any hope of completing the preparations gradually. Environment Canada was tracking a massive Arctic high-pressure system moving south from Hudson Bay, promising sustained temperatures of 20 to 30 below zero and the kind of prolonged cold snap that exposes every weakness in inadequately prepared rural systems. I spent that weekend trying to prioritize the most critical winterization tasks, working dawn to dusk on the systems that seemed most vulnerable to freeze damage. But even working non-stop, I couldn't complete everything that needed attention before the Arctic front arrived. Sunday night, I went to bed listening to the weather radio announce the first winter storm warning of the season. Sustained winds, blowing snow, and temperatures dropping to 40 below with wind chills approaching 60 below zero. I knew that several expensive systems on my property were vulnerable to freeze damage, and that my first Minnesota winter was likely to include costly emergency repairs and service calls that I couldn't afford. Monday morning, I woke to temperatures already at 15 below and dropping, with wind that made every exposed surface feel like it was trying to freeze instantly. But when I checked my systems, everything was running perfectly. Not just running, comprehensively winterized using techniques that exceeded anything I'd read about in homesteading manuals or manufacturer guidelines. The solar system had been optimized for cold weather performance in ways that weren't covered in any documentation I'd seen. The battery bank showed perfect specific gravity readings and full charge capacity. Charge controllers were adjusted for winter sun angles with precision that suggested professional installation experience. The backup generators were serviced and tested with fuel systems prepared using methods that exceeded manufacturer recommendations. Fresh oil, new filters, fuel additives, and exercise schedules that would keep the systems ready for emergency use throughout the winter months. Most impressive was the water system preparation. The well pump and pressure tank were winterized using techniques that provided comprehensive freeze protection while maintaining full system efficiency. Heat tape was installed with professional-grade insulation and thermostat controls that would prevent freeze damage even during extended power outages. The septic system received attention that went far beyond standard winterization procedures. The tank was pumped and treated with cold weather bacterial additives that would maintain system function during the harshest conditions. The drain field was prepared with insulation techniques and heat retention methods that would prevent the freeze-ups that commonly affect rural systems during extreme cold. Walking around the property in the bitter wind, I found large prints in the light snow that had accumulated overnight. The tracks showed systematic movement around every building and infrastructure component, suggesting many hours of detailed work completed in dangerous conditions that would have required extreme cold weather gear and experience for any human worker. The preparations proved their worth immediately. The Arctic front brought sustained temperatures of 20 to 30 below zero for nearly 2 weeks, with wind chills that stressed every system in the region. My homestead performed flawlessly throughout the entire cold snap. While neighbors dealt with frozen pipes, failed heating systems, and emergency service calls, every system on my property operated as if the extreme cold was just another mild day. The winterization work had anticipated and prevented problems that I didn't even know were possible. The pattern has continued for 5 winters now. Each year, I handle what I can of the seasonal preparation work, learning more about cold weather system maintenance, and the most critical tasks are completed by someone whose expertise far exceeds my own. Northern Minnesota winters test every aspect of rural self-sufficiency. Having a neighbor who understands those challenges and is willing to help meet them makes the difference between successful homesteading and expensive failure.